And so what I'm going to talk about today is a really, really big topic. I will barely be able to do it justice in an hour, but hopefully I'll give you all some things to think about on the leadership development problem and market and why it feels broken. And there's really three things going on that I want to talk about. The first is the way the world of work has changed and the nature of leadership and what we're expecting out of leaders and the demographics of leadership. The second is the leadership development process and the history of it. And I'm going to talk a little bit about how it has been done in the past and how it's being done now in the future. And then the third is the way learning in general has changed. And all three of those things impact our ability to develop leaders. And I think it's also really important to remember BetterUp is an example of a really incredibly interesting company that is revolutionizing the way people learn, particularly in leadership situations and leadership roles. So I will talk a little bit about BetterUp as we get going. So first, the world of work. Now, I hate to talk about technology when we're talking about leadership, but technology seems to be the number one thing that's bothering people right now. We have we're about 5 years into the digital disruption problem that most companies have gone through. And as you'll see, it is not slowing down, it's accelerating. In fact, I just spent the day yesterday with Mercer, and they do an annual study of about 7,000 respondents, and we were going through some of the data. And one of the things they found was that the number one thing that companies are now concerned about is the nature of the work itself, the jobs, and our ability to redefine those jobs and redefine them in a meaningful way as technology automates and more intelligently informs many of the things that we do. And that falls on the shoulders of leaders. It doesn't fall on the shoulders of HR. I mean, it would be nice if HR knew how to do all this, but as you can see from the research that Mercer uncovered, and this is the same thing I find when I talk to HR departments don't really know how to redesign all these jobs, a lot of times because HR is not involved in the details of what's going on. So that falls on the shoulders of leadership. The second issue affecting leadership is the fact that most companies are becoming service delivery organizations. The more we automate things, the more service-related our businesses become. And that's a little bit counterintuitive to what we thought was going to happen with technology, but actually it makes sense that the more digitally connected you are to your consumers, customers, hosts, guests, whoever your customers are, the faster you have to respond and the more quickly you have to iterate on your offerings. So we're all becoming part of, sort of, in a sense, service delivery people. And the economy in whole is becoming much more service-oriented. If you look at this data, this is the data on the number of jobs. But if you look at stock market capitalization data, 90% of stock market capitalization is now intangible assets, which means it's services. And leaders are the ones, and we'll talk about what leaders means in a minute, are the ones that help people make sure they are ready to deliver the services that customers need. We also have this problem of skills. Most of the research that comes out right now, and I'm going to show you some of this in a few minutes, shows that either the number one or number two issue in most companies is skilling, continuous skilling, upskilling, reskilling, transforming skills. And the second one is usually something along the lines of retention, engagement, or employee experience. And CEOs are now concerned about this. So what leaders do is different. And it's interesting, when I finished the last study I did for Deloitte a couple months ago, and we looked at leadership in some of the research that came back, most of the companies that responded to that survey were expecting leaders to do very traditional things. Hit their numbers, make their sales targets, keep their operational metrics on track, and of course keep their people happy as part of that, but more as a means to an end. Now what you're seeing, and what I think most of you are probably sensing, is that if your leaders are not developing and coaching the people around them, they're not doing their jobs. And if we are not continuously developing and coaching the leaders themselves, they're not effective and they're not going to stay. And one of the reasons that's a challenge is that work has become harder. We're in this wonderful economy. At least it's wonderful for some of us. It's not wonderful for everybody. But the stock market's been going high. The interest rates are still low. The unemployment rate is low. But people are working very hard. And one of the reasons they're working very hard is that productivity has not caught up to the economy. And what's happened, and this is a historic artifact that happens during industrial revolutions, that we're 5 years roughly into the digital revolution. We have not redesigned leadership models and organization structures to facilitate an effective, productive business in a digital age. And because people are, as I'll show you the data, people are working more hours. They're getting too many messages, too many emails. They're not sure where they should be focusing their time. There's lots of distractions. Walk down the street, you can see everybody's got their headphones plugged into something. I'm not sure what they're listening to, but we're not. So leaders have to provide focus. So there's sort of some new things going on here. Another thing that's important to think about in terms of leadership, before I get into the real issues, is the fact that we have to ask leaders and expect leaders to do a lot more than just hiring great people and setting goals and doing annual performance appraisals. They have to make sure that people are productive. The economics data shows, and I've shared this in some other webcasts, that the demographics of all of the developed economies, U.S., U.K., Germany, Japan, most of the big countries that are developed countries, we're slowing demographic growth. The birth rate, the fertility rate is below replacement. The fastest growing segment of the workforce is now people over the age of 60 or 65. And so we can't hire people to grow the way we have in the past. We're going to have to grow by making people more effective and more productive. And productivity, when you ask CEOs, and I just looked at a study of this, when you ask people who owns productivity, there is no chief productivity officer in most companies. It's the CEO, which means it's falling on the shoulders of each individual line leader. So this is another part of the leadership equation. And then there's the issue of diversity and inclusion, and both gender and cultural and racial and generational diversity. All of those are shouldered by managers and leaders. And particularly now, as the workforce ages, and I'm going to be writing about this a lot because this is a big deal that I don't think companies have paid enough attention to. Most leaders have people working for them that are 1 or 2 generations older than they are. I had an interesting experience at Deloitte where most of the time I was at Deloitte almost 7 years, and most of the time in fact, the entire time I was at Deloitte, I worked at people that were either a little bit younger than me or significantly younger than me. And that was a great learning experience for me, and it was a great learning experience for them. So this is a dimension of leadership that is important as we develop leaders and find leaders. One of the things that is important, I think, to think about in leadership, as I get into the leadership issue in a few minutes, is the fact that in the traditional view of leader, if you read the Leadership Pipeline by Ram Charan or a lot of the more traditional HR books on leadership, there's a lot of talk about readiness. And I'm going to show you some data on succession management and how we, give people various developmental assignments, and we, evaluate them over many periods, many years, when they will be ready for leadership. I really think we have to let go of that idea. Mark Zuckerberg is I think he's in his mid to early 30s. I'm not sure how old he is, but he's running one of the most successful companies that's ever been created. Now, you may argue about various things about Facebook, but he's done a great job of building an incredibly big company. Many of the leaders that are running the most effective digital organizations today are much, much younger and have much less experience than we would have expected. So this idea that we're going to develop leaders slowly, and we're going to plot them up the 9-box grid and develop these succession pipelines, that actually isn't the way it works anymore. And so we're going to have to let go of that. But let me talk about learning first before I get into that. Learning is a big priority. In the last research I did with Deloitte and the research that came out from Mercer comes up. You know, skills are really really an anxiety issue at work. You know, if you're somebody like me, it's different for me. I'm an analyst, but you know, if you're a professional in sales, marketing, customer service, healthcare, nursing, IT, whatever it is, you can bet that there's something going on in your domain that you need to learn about. And 60% of people basically are saying, I'm a little nervous that if I don't keep up on all these things going on in my domain, I could lose my job. And, you know, even though we have great L&D departments and spend, you know, a lot of money on L&D, I'll show you the numbers on that in a minute, employees basically believe it's up to them. And this is kind of a new trend. You know, when I did research on talent management a decade ago, the traditional model was that managers were responsible for the development of their people. I don't think that's really true anymore. Yes, managers should be developmental and coaching and provide support and have a growth mindset and all that, but they don't know everything that the people working for them need to know. Those days are over. In some situations, you will have a leader who is a technical expert and is a domain expert, but in a lot of cases you won't, because the people in your team will be working on projects that are new or different. And so leadership has a different role. And so empowering people to learn is a sort of an existential issue with the leadership market. Not only is it a general issue for skills and economic development, but it's an issue for every individual. The research on wages shows that the skills that are in the most demand right now are not AI and machine learning. Yes, we want AI and machine learning people. I mean, there's no question about that. But that's a very small number of people. Compared to the 1.5 billion or 2 billion people that are working around the world, it's a small number. It's in the tens of thousands. It's a few percent. The skills that people want is they want to know how to be effective in the organization. They want to know how to work with customers better. They want to know how to work better in teams. They want to know what they can do to get promoted. And what the research is showing here, and this chart is showing you, is that is a combination of soft skills and hard skills, not only hard skills. And what most HR people are finding when you survey them is that we don't have the soft skills in the market the way we did in the past. In fact, one of the well-being companies I talked to a couple of weeks ago, it was a really interesting company. Actually, it was a well-being company, and I had another similar meeting with a virtual reality training company, that there's an increase in the prevalence of autistic-like behavior at work. I'm not saying, I don't know if autism is going up. I think it might be, but these technology tools are affecting us in cognitive ways that are in some ways hurting our soft skills and our ability to work with each other in teams. Collaboration is a challenge, a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, communication. The number one missing skill in the San Francisco Bay Area, according to LinkedIn, which is the number one most in-demand workplace in the United States as of last year, is communications. It is not software engineering. It is not data science. It is not SQL. It is not AI. And so one of the things we have to do as leaders in the development of leadership and also in the assessment of leadership is teach people how to be, how to get along with each other and how to work in teams. And that is happening. Okay, when you look at leadership, it's an interesting problem. I mean, I've been around long enough. I've done a lot of surveys on issues that companies worry about, and leadership, the leadership pipeline, leadership capabilities always scores in the top 3 or 4. Right now, it's about as high as it's ever been. There are other issues that are just as important, but leadership is very high. The big thing that most companies are feeling and sensing is not that we don't have enough leaders, but we don't have the right type of leaders. I'm in my early 60s, so I've worked through this sort of general business climate well before digital. And it used to be pretty, you could read the books by GE and Jack Welch and others, and you could, buy books on leadership, and you could kind of figure out Leaders have to be good at delegation. They have to be good at setting goals. They have to be good at budgets. They have to be good at collaborating with their peers. They need to understand the business and the industry. I mean, you could look at these leadership models and copy them. And every company kind of created their own, but they were all kind of the same. They all kind of looked the same. That's not actually the way it is anymore. We've sort of rethought that. And one of the things Deloitte did is this interesting project called Digital DNA, where Deloitte with MIT actually studied the leadership behaviors of the companies that were thriving in the digital economy and found that they were operating in a very different way. The leaders were much more experimental. They were much more digitally savvy. But you can see this when you look through this. And they have a sense of growth and rapid change. And that's why young leaders are outperforming old leaders in many situations. I'm not saying that youth is necessarily good or bad, but that characteristics have changed. And that's, really a big part of this. As far as how we develop leaders, it's a gigantic, messy, somewhat weird market. It's about 11 or 12 billion. Every time I study it, it comes in, it comes out around that range. Every day I get an email about another book written on leadership. I think you could look up leadership in Amazon and probably find 100,000 books. I'm not kidding. There are hundreds of leadership coaches and consultants. The bigger players, DDI, Korn Ferry, Skillsoft, they all have leadership content. There are videos on every website of every educational institution about leadership. All of the universities provide executive education programs on leadership. I happen to work with the UC Berkeley people. There are professors studying leadership. It's a never-ending topic. And I'm in the middle of a book myself, which eventually I'll finish, and what I've learned is the thing that's really existential about it is that the way we lead in organizations is now different. A lot of you have probably seen this chart before, but let me just spend a minute on it. One of the things that's happened in the digital transformation of companies is that we have not been able to keep up with the pace of change in traditional hierarchical management structures. And this is stuff I happen to have studied a lot because I've been writing this book. If you look at the history of organizations, the picture on the left goes back to the days of the railroads. In the very early industrial revolution of the United States, and probably earlier than that in other parts of the world, where people figured out that if we organized ourselves in functional groups and we had supervisors who told people what to do, and we had supervisors who had supervisors and they had supervisors, it would be easier to run these industrial organizations. So we built all this methodology and infrastructure and thinking about hierarchy. Well, hierarchy isn't what you thought it was. We all grew up with hierarchy. We have parents, we have teachers, we have business leaders, we have political leaders. The world is not like that anymore. Today, if you look at the high-performing companies, people are rewarded not by their level, but by their skills, by their capabilities, by their experience, by their ability to influence customers. And so we've moved to this management philosophy where the team is the center of the company and the rest of the company supports the team. That's a very difficult thing to do. This chart is 3 years old. We first started talking about this with companies in 2016. And in the first year or so, we showed this to people. They were kind of like, well, I'm not sure what you mean, and I'm not sure how this would work. But now it's really happening. In the research that was published a couple months ago by Deloitte, almost a third of the companies basically said, we are a network. We are a team-based company. We are not a hierarchy. Now, there still are hierarchies and there are levels, but even Hewlett-Packard, who was at our research conference in May, basically said, we had something like, I forget, I think they had 50 or 60 levels, job levels. They stripped it down to 14 or 15. They got rid of job titles. So you didn't have VP, senior executive VP, director VP. They got rid of all that because it doesn't help anybody. And that is an artifact of a different way of working. What companies are finding is when they move to this more agile model of work, they perform better. I mean, most of the companies in this research, and this is relatively new, basically said that as a result of being in a more team-centric structure, we are performing higher. And we're using different methods of doing that. Agile, Scrum, OKR. I mean, these things, nobody talked about this stuff when you went to leadership development in the 1960s or 1970s or 1980s. These words didn't even exist. But these are very well-established management practices on how to run organizations, how to run teams, how to run projects that leaders need to understand. The concept of an OKR, if you see that little yellow line on the bottom, you notice it's actually gone way up in the last couple of months. An OKR is a concept of goal setting called objective and key results. It's a very simple concept. It's easy to understand. I won't get into details here, but it was invented at Intel. It's been popularized in software. It's sort of sweeping across different parts of business. The other model used to be MBOs, management by objectives. And I spent 15 or 20 years of my career with MBOs. MBOs were goals that were set in January that you were paid in December, that no one looked at for an entire year. And nobody else knew what your MBOs were because it was kind of a secret. This is a totally different way of managing people. So this is one of the reasons why the leadership gap exists. And when you look at the data, this is brand new data from DDI. I went through some of the research that DDI published a couple months ago, and I was really sort of astounded by it. 2/3 of companies believe that they don't have the right pipeline. Almost more than 3/4 believe their career pathing is not working correctly. There's a big announcement coming out next week from a vendor on careers, and I was looking at some of the research on that this morning. 82% of employees now believe that their career is their responsibility. It is not their manager's responsibility. I'm going to show you some old data on this, but most of us grew up, if you're my age, in a world where leaders basically manage your career. Well, that's not even true anymore. Now everybody manages their own career. And so, these things that we've done over the years in leadership development have to change. We also know that coaching has become more important than ever, and this gets into BetterUp. This is I'm going to give you a couple slides here from the DDI study, and the reason I like the DDI study is DDI has been in the leadership market for a very long time, and they have studied this in great detail. And this is a study that DDI did with Conference Board, which it's free, you can get it online. And it's brand new, it's a couple months old, is they found that what leaders want more than anything else is a coach. They don't want a boss telling them what to do. They want someone they can tap on the shoulder and ask questions. And as you can see in this particular polar chart, the high-performing companies are more experimental and more agile by nature, and so they need this kind of a coaching experience. And that's what BetterUp has done, is they've really institutionalized this at scale. For those of you that have had a coach, it's a rather incredible experience to have a good coach. It's actually, a transformational experience, and I'll talk a little bit more about this. And I've, seen companies have had coaching models for a long, long time. I remember BAE years ago had institutionalized a coaching model where every leader in the company was required to have 2 mentees or was to coach 2 people. And so it would go both ways. You would learn how to be a coach as you moved up the leadership pipeline, and you would have a senior or coach assigned to you. That is a very low cost, approach to leadership development that has become much, much more popular than it was in the past. It was always there, but I think it's become critical because of the nature of these jobs changing so quickly. We also know, as I mentioned earlier, that growth mindset and culture of inclusion and diversity are also characteristics of high-performing leaders. I don't need to talk to you guys. I'm sure most of the people on the phone are from HR. I don't need to tell you how important gender diversity and pay equity and cultural diversity is, in your companies. It's a CEO level issue now. It has to be embraced by leaders. Nobody in HR is going to be able to enforce any diversity rules if the leadership model does not include it. If we aren't developing leaders in an inclusive and diverse way, and holding ourselves accountable. And by the way, one of the things on diversity that I've learned over the years doing a lot of studies on this, and we talked about this yesterday with Mercer, is despite your self-described, voluntary, assessment of how good you are at diversity, in every study we've ever done, people are overconfident about their ability to create a diverse culture. It's way harder than you think. And the only way you create it is by reinforcing it in leadership in every single talent practice. Every time you hire somebody, every time you promote somebody, every time you evaluate somebody, every time there's a job change, a promotion, a new assignment, there has to be a diversity lens applied to that, and particularly in your leadership population. So that is a hugely important dimension of leadership that has become really central. I mentioned the importance of coaching. This came out in the DDI data. Many studies have been done on this. BetterUp has quite a few of them, that the companies that create coaching experiences and mindsets are outperforming those that don't. And there's, several reasons for that. One is, of course, that you get better development, but there's another thing that happens is that when you have a coaching mindset, you build better relationships. Because when a company operates like a network, who you know, who you trust, how well you understand the other parts of the company that you're not involved in are absolutely critical to your success. And having a coach inside or outside of your company is part of that. The other aspect that I want to talk about in leadership characteristics is the idea of collective leadership. In the, sort of the older books of leadership, and if you read some of the stuff about GE and, sort of traditional organizations, there's this idea of I was just watching a movie about this last night. This idea of the hero leader, who is a hardworking, dedicated individual, usually a white male, but not always, who pines away, working very long hours on everybody's behalf behind the scenes or maybe in public. That isn't the way it works anymore. Yes, it's very hard to be a top leader, and it is demanding and very challenging and stressful in all sorts of ways. But more and more of the research that we did at Deloitte and other companies have done, including this data from DDI, shows that collective leadership is what matters. Building a symphony of leaders that work together is the key to success. And it's a funny thing that's happened. This is something we talked about a lot at Deloitte. We have gone, in the last decade, we've kind of gone through a proliferation of C-level roles. It used to be there was a CEO and that was it. Well, now there's a chief revenue officer, a chief compliance officer, a chief learning officer, a chief HR officer, a chief ethics officer, a chief digital officer, a chief customer officer. I mean, I don't know how many different C-level jobs are. There's probably 20 or 30. I don't even know all of them. And, all these jobs were created as a transformation tool to try to get the company to move into a new direction at a more rapid rate. But what we're actually finding is that didn't work that well. What really works is when all of the leaders work together on these projects and bring their domain expertise in a symphony, in a synchronized way. And that's what this research is showing, is that the companies that are able to operate in a team are far outperforming those that aren't. I mean, I don't know if you've read The Speed of Trust by Stephen Covey. I mean, there's lots of books that have been written on this. When people work together, respecting each other's expertise without everybody feeling like they're the C-level whatever, the organization performs better. That gets back to this issue of empowerment, gets it back to the issue of hierarchy. And then the other aspect that's very new and important, and this is not, this didn't come out of nowhere, but it's always been there, but it's become more important than ever, is this idea of purpose. We're in a world where most employees have, if you're a high performing or high ambition employee, you've got job options. You can go out on LinkedIn or Indeed or Glassdoor and look for another job. You know how much other people are making. You've got friends connected to you on social media. You've got recruiters coming after you. If you don't feel that the company you're working for is both a good career choice for you and a reasonably well-paying job, and you don't feel like there's a purpose, you're looking around. And so leaders have to be ethical and honest. Now, the sad thing about, this statement is, almost every day there's something in the Wall Street Journal about somebody doing something that's not ethical and not honest. But those are the ones that the reporters like to write about. I think what you find, though, in the highest performing companies that I've studied, if you look at Salesforce and Wegmans and Southwest Airlines and Whole Foods, and the companies that far outperform their peers in financial profitability and in employment engagement and in retention, they are purposeful companies. That is a characteristic of leadership too. Okay, so that's a little bit about what's been going on in the leadership, in the domain of leadership itself. Now, let's talk about leadership development. This is I actually redid something I did years ago at Deloitte, and I took our maturity model that we had built many years ago, which is a little bit old, and I rejiggered it for the modern world. And I basically said, look, there's sort of 4 levels, and those estimates, those percentages are basically rough estimates of based on the last couple of research studies I've done, roughly how many companies are at what level. There's different ways of thinking about leadership development. The first is what I would call inconsistent management training. And this is what most small companies do. Oh, you've been promoted to supervisor. We're going to send you to the, so-and-so certification course or this supervision course. There's a 2-day course in supervision being taught by the AMA. It's next Thursday. I'm signing you up. And so you go over there and you learn a lot. You meet some people that are in, you learn a lot of things about supervision and management. Most of us that move into management for the first time are surprised at how difficult it is. It's a totally different career to succeed through the success of others, and everybody learns how to be a leader at different pace. And so that's 30% of the market. And you can buy all sorts of stuff, and you can send people to these courses, and they will come back with some better information than they had before. But you're not getting business context. You're not getting culture. You're not getting alignment. There are a lot of things you're not getting. So the next level is you structure it. And you say, okay, all supervisors in sales, at their first level, they're going to go through this kind of program. At their second level, they're going to go through this program. And as they move up in the management hierarchy, they're going to get more business strategy and more competitive strategy and more financial acumen, and you build a structure around it. And at that point, in the green box, you have a head of leadership development in your company. You have somebody who's pulling this together with the help of consultants, and you're taking people through these curriculum. And you're probably spending 2 or 3 times as much money on average, and the CEO or somebody at a senior level is invested in this. Then you get to a level, but it's still an HR. It's still an HR program. Then at the third level, you reach a point where the CEO is involved, and you realize that the development process is more than training. It is a culture building, connecting process too. Because there's no point in being a really good manager if you don't know how to work with your peers or you don't understand what the other people at leadership are doing. So that reaches the level 3, where I think that's more common for big companies. And then eventually you get to a level 4, where leadership is considered to be part of everybody's job. And I'm not saying everybody's a manager and everybody has direct reports and everybody has a big title. But in more sophisticated companies, particularly in consumer packaged good companies, companies where the business itself is very decentralized and very fragmented, there are a lot of leaders. There are a lot of people leading a lot of things. I mean, at Deloitte, I always used to laugh. We would go around the room and people would introduce themselves, and there would be like 20 people in the room, and everybody in the room would say, I lead blah, 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 blah. I lead something. And they actually did at Deloitte. I mean, they weren't, they didn't have a whole bunch of people reporting to them, but they were responsible for leading something, either a client initiative, a product initiative, a marketing initiative, whatever it is. And that was part of their culture. And in that vein, if you reach level 4, you're at the point where you have to provide leadership development to everybody. If I'm an engineer and I'm being asked to lead a project, And I've never done that before, and I don't even know how to run a meeting, and I'm kind of intimidated about holding somebody accountable for something and setting goals. I mean, I'm going to need a coach or somebody to help me with that. And when you reach that level 4, type of company, you now can develop leaders in amazing places that you never could before than you could at level 1. It's funny. I went back and I looked at some of my old research on this, and this is a very traditional program from a big company. It's at least a decade old. This is the way leadership used to happen. Leadership development used to happen. You got plugged in like a railroad car into the leadership train, and you just went for a ride. And over a year or 2 period, you went through these activities that you would go through to anoint yourself as a leader. And this was incredibly, useful, immersive process that companies went through. And this has not gone away. This still takes place in a lot of big companies, but it isn't enough. It's expensive, it's complex, and it doesn't deal with the fact that leaders are being developed at all times. The other thing that's different about leadership today, and one of the reasons it feels broken, is that in the traditional hierarchies of companies, it was obvious who the leaders were. You were either on the left side of this pyramid or the right side. And you could tell from your job title. And your business card would tell people where you were. And your pay would vary. You generally would make more money if you went up a management track. And so everybody at some point in their career would sort of scratch their heads and say, well, I really need to be a manager. Now, that's not necessarily good, because in a lot of companies, we don't need any more managers. Spans of control have gotten bigger, and we actually need more specialists. We need more people that can work with customers that are really, really good at their jobs. So rewarding people for moving into management is a little bit of an old-fashioned idea. I mean, yes, managers are more powerful in a sense, and they might make more money, but they're not necessarily more valuable to the company. It depends on your culture and your perspective. And people develop in different ways. They don't develop through those left or right lines anymore. They develop in lots of different ways. And so the leadership model and the leadership development strategy has to accommodate the fact that in any given company, people are going through a whole variety of different developmental experiences on a given year, all of which might need help. I like to show this chart. This is something I developed for the book I'm finishing, that essentially shows that the idea of somebody, in the HR department deciding who the leaders are going to be and putting them in a little room and having a 9-box grid and a succession plan and a bunch of little lines that says when this guy goes and we're going to put this guy in his place and this woman's going to. I mean, that's not a bad thing to do, but it's not enough. It has to happen at a much more local level. So this is one of the reasons that the leadership development market feels broken, is that we haven't necessarily figured out how to adopt to this. Now, one of the ways this has changed and one of the innovations that's taking place is new types of leadership assessments. I don't think you can really build a leadership pipeline in your company without a model. You need some framework for what leadership means to your company and some way of assessing when somebody is ready or who has the characteristics or what characteristics are needed to be a good leader. That is a really important thing to do. We discovered this very early in our research, that if you don't have that kind of discipline, it's very political and gives people a lot of uncertainty, and you have very high turnover. So that is, continues to be an issue. And so I think every year or two, especially during a transformation, companies should revisit their leadership model and publish it and make it clear and communicate it to people and build some form of assessments around it so that everyone can participate in it and learn from it and use it. The other reason that I want to touch for a few minutes on why leadership development has changed is that succession management has changed. Let me just sort of go back a little bit on succession management. The idea of succession management goes back to World War I, when we were basically fighting in trenches. And this is the history I've read about it. It may go way be earlier than that, where basically they had what were called replacement charts, where if this guy got shot, this guy would take his place. And then that moved into senior leaders of CEOs. When CEOs, people used to die in their 50s and 60s in the middle of the decade. And so, if the CEO got sick and had a heart attack, you need to have somebody ready to take his or her place. So there were these succession charts. And so we had basically replacement planning exercises about who would take what job. And then we kind of went through the period of talent management where people built 9-box grids and looked at potential versus performance and said, well, this guy or gal is sort of ready for that role, so let's prepare them and let's give them a chance to get it. And then we reached a point where and that was often driven by HR, and then in great companies, the CEOs got very involved in that. But now we need to do it at a much more team level. Within a team, within a project, within a customer group, if the wrong person's in the wrong job, or we need somebody to replace a leadership position, how do we do that? We can't go to the 9-box grid and wait a year for the HR department to put them on a new track. That's just not going to happen fast enough. So a lot of this stuff that we sort of validated as standards of succession management is just too slow. It has to happen faster. Now, how does that happen? It generally happens at a team and organizational level, not at a CEO level. We studied this many years ago, and we did this is probably from the early 2000s. We asked companies, how do you develop people in your company? Are people responsible for developing their own careers? Do managers do it? Do business units do it? Do enterprises do it? And we found at that point in time that the companies that had enterprise-wide development tracks were outperforming those that had individually driven development tracks. And that was in the days when companies were much more predictable and much more hierarchical. And so what we used to take away from this chart was that telling somebody to manage their own career was a mistake because they really had no tools to do that. Well, that's actually inverted now. I mean, now we have to basically create an environment where people know what the roles and the opportunities are, but we give them the power to find the opportunities and to interview for them. And so the first or second biggest trend in the Deloitte study, and it also came up in the Mercer study, was facilitating better talent mobility, giving people opportunities to move into higher level roles on their own with the tools of HR and with the tools of management without waiting for your manager to find you that job and assign it to you. I was at a very big, successful financial services company a couple months ago. We were talking about this, and they said, and we were talking about why it was so hard for them to move people around from role to role and function to function. And what they said was the problem was they're a really well-run company. They said the problem was we built an entire culture for a decade focused on the manager, that was the manager's job to evaluate your next position and to offer it to you. And we now realize that is getting in the way, because not that we don't have good managers, we do have good managers, but they don't know all the opportunities available in the company, and they aren't necessarily skilled enough to know what the next right job may be. So there's an enormous new trend of tools and software being developed for career management inside of companies that allows individuals to find the jobs that are best for them. Obviously, their managers are involved in this. They're not doing it without their managers' involvement, but you have to make it possible for the managers and easy and incent the managers to allow them to do that. It's affecting everything in the organization. And it's pretty complicated. I mean, when I look at it, what's going on in this issue of talent mobility, it affects reward systems and how HR provides transitions and the culture of leadership and how people look for advice, and lots coming out on this next week. There's going to be a bunch of announcements on this next week, which gets back to coaching. And I want to go back to BetterUp for a minute. This is a chart from BetterUp. BetterUp is a really interesting company. If you don't know them, they have really pioneered the idea that the best way to learn is to have a coach. And I can't argue with that. It's absolutely true. And what they basically have institutionalized this idea that if you want to be a good leader or just a good whatever you're doing, you need to get coached on how to do it. And it isn't just about going to a course and coming back to the office, but it's going to a course, learning something, doing it, getting feedback on it, getting coached on it, and doing it again and again, and doing it in a repeatable way. Now, I call it learning in the flow of work. That's the way I position it, and I'll explain what I mean by that in a minute. But the BetterUp people basically are saying the same thing, that learning, doing, and being have to be integrated together. So one of the things I would tell you that is, in addition to building a competency model and creating more agile career structure inside of your company, is finding a way to facilitate coaching. Now, the BetterUp technology and platform will assign you external coaches, or I think they can do internal coaches too. This is turning out to be a really, really important part of leadership development. In fact, if you look at the data on performance, this is some data that came from BetterUp's implementation at Workday. And Workday is a great company that's been extremely successful, but it's not easy to run a company that's growing at 40% a year. Everybody, you may think that working at Workday is a piece of cake. It's probably a hard place to work with all of the growth going on there, and they've had their issues as everybody else has. They have proven at this using the BetterUp tool system that the people that go through the coaching exercise at Workday are performing better, they are happier, they are doing a better job of leading, they are having more influence on the organization. So this is got to be a part of it. Okay, and the third thing I would say is just in terms of the leadership approach is creating a purpose. This is a chart that I've used for years, and I used to have the blue and the red circles, and I added the green one this year because I think more and more of the assessment of a good leader and the development of a good leader is teaching this person or helping this person learn how to be purposeful and meaningful to the people around them. We all need inspiration in times of stress, and work is stressful right now for most people. And so, identifying what drives people and what makes people happy and what people want to get out of their lives and their jobs and their careers is part of being a good leader. And it is part of your process for leadership development and your process for career management in general. Okay, so that's a little bit about all that stuff. The last thing I want to talk about is learning itself. How do you do all this? The biggest thing that holds people back in learning, whether you're talking about leadership development or supervisory education or anything that you have to learn, is people don't have enough time. This comes out of the LinkedIn research. This comes out of the research that Udemy has done. I mean, lots of studies have uncovered the same thing. I don't have time to go to this course. I don't have time to finish this video. I don't have time to do this assessment. Whatever it is, I'm too busy. Now, some of that is cultural. If your company doesn't take it seriously, you haven't been given enough time, and you don't feel that you have enough time because you're too busy doing other things, and you're not at the conference call or the meeting or whatever the customer thing is you're supposed to be doing. But we have to give people time. But the real solution is that we now can do it using new modalities. One of the things I've been working on in the Bersin Academy, for those of you that are familiar with it, is we have a whole macro and micro learning architecture where you can learn in whatever amount of time you have. And I won't get into a big sales pitch about the Bersin Academy, but one of the cool things about the Bersin Academy is you can come into the Bersin Academy, you can learn for 5 minutes, and you can leave, and you can come back whenever you want and pick up where you left off. That's called micro learning. It's a relatively new idea, but it's exploded across the L&D space. That has to be coupled with macro learning. You can't do all of one or the other. They have to go together. If you're learning how to be a supervisor, a leader, or line manager, senior executive, multifunctional leader, there's some things you're going to have to learn. You're going to have to spend a couple of days diving into some things, working with other people, talking to experts. You might have some university professors involved that are really going to reshape your head. You won't change the way you think about something in 5 minutes. You will if you spend a day or two challenging yourself to do things differently. So we need to do both. And the idea that I've put together on this is that we need to do this in the flow of work. At certain points of time, we have very steep learning curve. If you get promoted into leadership or you get promoted into a higher level job, you're on a very steep learning curve. And those steep learning curves are times when you need macro learning. You need interventions that are significant and well architected and designed to get you that new state. And then as you become better at that new role, you can live off micro learning or coaching, and then go back during transitions where you need macro learning again. And the reason I showed this curve going down is that, everybody, including leaders, reach a point of plateau where there's a new challenge or a new opportunity or a new situation they are not prepared for, and they are not learning anything. And they need an intervention to move back up to the green line, or else they go down the red line. So one of your strategies in learning is to give people both macro and micro learning together, and giving them the opportunity to teach each other. One of the vendors I've spent a lot of time with recently is a company called 360 Learning that prides itself on allowing everybody in the company to teach others what they know. That's what mentoring is all about. That's what coaching is all about. That should be part of your leadership development too. It also turns out, if you look at the research that's been done on flow, on human sort of happiness at work, being in a sense of a state of anxiety or close to a state of anxiety is not good, but nor is being bored. We need to keep people in the middle of this line where they're constantly getting challenged enough that they feel they can develop on a continuous basis. If you can keep people in this little band of flow here, you're going to have a really highly engaged workforce. You're going to have great leadership pipeline. You're going to have a great customer base and great company. So anyway, that's been going on. The other thing that we've learned about learning is that you don't learn through repetition. You learn through practice. When you teach somebody something once, they remember 28% of it. If you teach it to them multiple times, they remember about half of it. If you give them the concepts behind it, they'll remember about 40% of it. But if they practice it, if they use it, if they act on it, as I showed you earlier in that model from Better Up, they're going to remember it. In leadership development, that's having a drive. We used to, when I worked at IBM, we used to, your manager used to come out on sales calls with you. I had a great manager and he used to come out on sales calls. And on the way home, we'd drive in the car. He would talk to me about what went well and what didn't go well. And I remembered that. And then the next time we'd do it again and he would show up. And that was a good experience for me. And, he understood that. So that's also part of leadership, which is why I just want to remind you that all this online stuff only goes so far. Micro and macro learning is part of leadership development, but so is getting people together. The most effective leadership programs usually do include a couple of day offsite at a university, at a great location, where people have a chance to get away and talk to each other. And that is part of leadership development too. So I just want to remind you of that. Okay, I'm a little bit short on time. I want to take a little bit of time for questions. Let me just jump ahead to one more topic, and then I will wrap up. The other thing I just want to wrap up on, and I won't talk a lot more about L&D because there's a million things we can talk about on L&D, is this idea of trust. The other aspect I touched on briefly in leadership is that leaders that are trusted, leaders that truly care about people, both inside the company and outside the company, are very highly regarded right now. And that has got to be part of your strategy. Both identify people that are highly trusted and teach people and encourage and reward them for trusted behaviors and growth mindset. This is what Microsoft's been going through. This is what IBM's been going through, is learning how to create a leadership culture and a leadership philosophy of trust. It pays off in terms of financial performance, and I think it's a new philosophy. I think it's a management philosophy that's very much in vogue right now that you should make sure you're taking advantage of. I'm sure a lot of you are. but it's a different way of thinking about leadership than we've taught about in the past. And that's the other reason I think that the leadership puzzle seems a little bit hard to put together. So anyway, that's kind of a lot of material. I would love to hear if there's any questions. Holly, I don't know if we have any time. We have like 3 minutes, but it's a big and complex topic, but a lot of interesting things going on and a lot of things you can do to really push the needle forward. So Holly, do you want to?
Yeah, I think we can power through just a couple here. So Josh, we'll get right into it, and just a time perspective, we've got about 3 minutes left, but I do think we can power through a couple good ones that have come in. So first, Ray asks if you can please talk through a high level, a change management framework to move from a competency-based leadership model to an agile one.
I think, yeah, that's a pretty interesting question. I'm not saying, I don't think you want to throw competencies out the door, but I think an agile leadership model involves empowering and rewarding leaders for having developmental conversations on a more regular basis. And one of the ways to create that kind of change might be, I'm just going to throw out an idea, to survey your employees maybe every 6 months or every quarter, how often you feel comfortable, and ask them how much time and energy is being paid by your leader for your personal development. How comfortable do you feel talking about your personal development plans? How much has been done to support your personal development plans? You could ask questions like that will suddenly send a message to the business folks. This is your job. And if you're not doing this stuff, you're not doing your job. Because, most of us are paid to hit the numbers and to do whatever our jobs are. That we're not thinking about this. So that's one way, is to put that into a formal evaluation process and let that survey data be used to compare leaders against each other. That might be one way to get started. If you want to contact me directly, that sounds like a more complicated question. I'll be happy to talk to you about it.
All right, thanks, Josh. And let's try to squeeze in one more. This one is from Kate. Pretty interesting question here. If you could please clarify your perspective on the role universities need to play in preparing people for soft skills and giving them what they need in that area.
Yeah, I have sort of a love-hate relationship with universities. I am on the board of the Berkeley Exec Ed program for Haas. Some universities make a lot of money selling, very high-priced executive education programs, and people really enjoy them because they get a chance to leave their corporate environment, get exposed to very, very smart new ideas, and collaborate with senior leaders from other companies in ways that they could never do inside of their own company. So in that part of the market, universities are very, very useful and important. I don't think most companies can afford to send all their leaders to those kinds of things, but those kinds of programs have an enormous amount of value, especially during big leadership transitions. I also think universities do a great job. Many professors, I just talked to Dave Ulrich yesterday, of studying, these topics I just talked about. I mean, what are the characteristics of high-performing leaders today? I can do the research, you can get the research from different consulting firms. Universities have unique ways of doing that. So those are both places where I think universities play a big role. Do they really understand how your company is going to need to run your company better? Probably not. You might be able to get a professor from the business school to come in and consult with you on that. So I think it varies depending on, and in certain industries, there are professors that are really, really deep domain experts. So that's where I think they play a big role. In terms of general management education, I don't know that they're as important, generally speaking.
All right, thanks so much, Josh. So we'll go ahead and start to wrap up. First of all, just a couple reminders for you today. We did have plenty of questions come in, and so those will be passed on to Josh, and he can follow up with you guys at a later time. Also, I know that today's webcast slides were not available during the live presentation. However, we will have them available just once we get off the air. And finally, today's webcast has been approved for HRCI and SHRM credit. Give us just about 24 hours and you can head on over to your MyHCI learning journey, and then download your transcript from there. One more big thank you to Josh, everyone at BetterUp, and for you for being here. We hope everyone has a great one.